The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazines. Thank you for watching today and joining us. Remember, if you like the videos you're about to see or any of the videos you've seen, you can find them on YouTube at Streamline Art Video. And of course, we'd love it for you to share it with your friends. Today, Tim Rees and modern figures.
Hi there, I'm Tim Rees and welcome to my video, large format painting. Today we're going to be doing a 6-foot painting and handle the mechanics of working large. You know, there's something about large paintings that are powerful and inspiring. You know, you walk into any museum and you see these large paintings of multiple figures, life-size or larger than life-size. There's something about that that stops us in our track and has that big wow factor. There's a power associated with large paintings that you just can't get with smaller paintings. So we're going to try to tackle today all of the facets that go into that, the complexities, trying to handle avoiding distortion, making sure that you can see the whole painting all at once, making sure that we're able to key all of the colors together, you know, how to apply paint effectively and logically to make sense, and hopefully make something that's cohesive and stands together on its own as just a big monumental work. And hopefully we're going to have some fun doing it, because there's few things that are as fun as swinging a giant brush around. We're going to first layer these fabrics and overlap them, because I'm going to get sort of a gold trim coming out. Here, go ahead and grab this. Let's shake this out real quick. But then it's more interesting when people see how we can just throw a few big pieces of fabric together. Now, I like this type of fabric because it's lightweight, a little stretchy, and sometimes it's a little transparent. So if I do a one layer, I can get a little bit of transparency and see some flesh tone kind of poking through in areas, which is nice. But today we want to make this green a little richer, so I'm going to layer them with the gold. So this is kind of fun because this is what a lot of artists of the past did. Like Sargent, who's known for these big dramatic portraits, would go and paint these rich people, and he didn't like any of their clothes, so he'd go into their closet and just grab a bunch of fabric. Actually, let's put this around your neck here, and then go ahead and pull your hair out so we don't pinch it. Thanks. And he would grab all this fabric, and he would make these interesting dramatic swoops and folds and get different textures that don't really make any sense if you think too long about it, but they look really nice in the painting. And this kind of corded strap idea that we have today is coming from Alphonse Mucha.
It's covering.
Okay. That's our primary concern first, and then we'll tweak anything later as needed. And you know, I'm not going to end up with a ton of information in this dress. We're really just going for the suggestion of all these fabrics. Now, for the sake of time, I did have my wife just sew together some sleeves, because it would have required a few more safety pins than I wanted to have to deal with. So let's see if this works. It should just slide right up, and then we're going to pinch it to get it tighter towards the top there. And then we'll cut the bottom to expose a little bit more. Okay. How does that feel? Does it feel like it's going to slide off? Actually, we don't need to pull it quite that high. We'll go like right here. And we'll just pinch. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, that's good. And then I want both arms kind of down at your side. You can bring them forward a little bit if you can grab on, yeah, just the edge of the stool like that. A little straighter. And then go ahead and, if you can, you might need to scoot a little forward on the stool, but drop one leg a little bit so you have one leg lower than the other. Yeah, yeah, and then chin up, yeah. So after we've decided on the pose and we've worked out some of the concepts of the fabric flow and the color, it's time to begin the color sketch. And this is one of the several preliminary studies that we do for larger works like this to ensure that when we go to the big canvas, we don't run into any issues with brush application or having the values work together or the colors work together. We want a good visual impression. We want to know exactly where we're going. And the color sketch is a way for us to solidify the entire scheme of the painting, so we don't get too caught up in just what we're observing, but we stay true to an original idea that we have for the picture. It's also going to allow us to respond more intuitively to what we see. You know, later on when we start painting the figure and we get really worked up in getting all of the details correct in the anatomy and the colors on the model, we tend to lose sight of that creative liberty and energy that we had when we initially came up with an idea. And so the color sketch is a way to cement that early on in the stage while we still have a lot of energy because we haven't been fatigued by painting for hours and hours on end. And we'll be able to translate some of that energy, hopefully, to the bigger painting in the end so that we can have something that looks dynamic and fresh as opposed to static and stale and labored. So today I'm going to be using pretty much all my colors here for the color sketch that we're going to be using for the final painting. And I'm going to just try to use sort of as much color as I can, not be concerned with staying naturalistic, but just try to really respond to what I'm observing. And try to create a layering process where I have thicker paint in some areas, thinner paint in some areas that is sort of aesthetically pleasing just to look at with the color sketch, even though I'm not going to be rendering anything out. It's going to be very simple, very basic, impressionistic, almost abstract really. And I'll solve a lot of these paint application issues so that when I go to the larger painting, I can use this as a guideline, much like if I were to be copying a master copy painting and just seeing the layers of paint that a master is using with each section of the painting. This is going to be my guideline for that larger version. So we're just going to try and cover the canvas really fast, not noodle over anything, not get caught up or hung up on trying to make anything too accurate, but really kind of let the creativity flow. And for me, this becomes the most fun part of painting, I think, because I don't have to concern myself with this end product of looking just like the model or being a nice finished painting. I just get to be free and expressive and throw it all out there. And then later on, we're going to analyze and decide what we need to keep and change and how we can translate this small picture into a full-size figure painting. So the pose we have here and the color scheme we have here is predominantly green. And I want to keep it keyed to that sort of green color. I've got some fabrics on the ground that will bounce some light up into the model. So I'm expecting some nice sort of golden yellow shadows. And overall, sort of a bright, energetic painting. So let's dive right into it here. I'm going to just mix up a few tick marks for where I might want some placement of shapes to be. I'll be using thinner for this stage of the painting. I'm not going to get any medium in here. I'm not going to try to think too much about any sort of special longevity of the painting. I'm just going to go kind of quick and thin, almost as though this were a thicker watercolor. And I'm just going to get a basic drawing first. You know, I said I wasn't going to concern myself too much with drawing, but I do want to make sure that at least the proportions in relation to the edges of the canvas kind of match up to what I'm observing, because this is going to give me that glimpse of what the final painting will look like. This little canvas that I have here is actually the same size, proportion-wise, as my final canvas. So if I like how the relationship to the edges of the canvas are on here, then I'll probably like how it looks on the larger scale painting. And I think that's why it's so important for me to do one of these preliminary studies. And I always make the proportions of this little painting the exact same as the final painting that I'm going to be working on. I do have a special color in here that I don't normally use, which is this green lake that I've pulled out, specifically because I thought I would be doing this green setup here. Normally, my method of color mixing is actually a pretty simplified method, and I try to think of it in terms of primaries. You know, if we think of how a computer works, it always creates a set of mixtures when it prints things out in terms of red, yellow, and blue. You know, printers use cyan, magenta, and yellow with black, CMYK. Now we don't typically think of magenta as a primary or even cyan as a primary. We kind of think of fire engine red as our red and sort of an ultramarine blue as our blue. But what you'll find is that the cyan, magenta, and yellow are truly opposite each other on the color wheel, and so they allow for a great variety of color mixing opportunity, whereas our traditional concept of what red, yellow, and blue is actually a little bit distorted, and it won't actually produce as large of a range of colors. So what I have here is essentially a lot of yellows, a lot of reds, and a lot of blues in different values, and I'll start to manipulate those around to create the colors that I see. Because I have these reds and yellows and blues in different value, I don't really have to use as much white to create the colors that I'm observing. The one exception would be, of course, the background, which would really require some whites to achieve a value that's that high. I'm going to use several different brushes here for a color sketch because I want to keep these colors really, really clean. So I'm going to use a brush for my flesh tones. I'm going to use a brush for my green fabric, and I'm going to use a brush for my background here. Just trying to mix up some flesh tone really quickly. I'm sticking to some primary colors, just a red and yellow and a blue, and I'm going to push these back and forth until I have something that's relatively close to the flesh tone that I see up there. Again, I'm not going to noodle too much. I'm just going to try to be really impulsive about it and throw some paint down there. There it is. And just build up this impression of what I'm observing here. Notice I just can kind of scrub paint in here. I don't have to worry about things getting too muddy as long as I keep to my color families. You know, I'm sticking to yellows and greens to craft this dress color here. I think I want her hips to be a little bit higher, maybe up here. So that's a decision that I'll make now so that I don't run into a lot of build up on this painting here, even the study here, and then have to go back and redo my idea and repaint the whole thing. It's much easier to correct a painting at the earlier stages. You know, if you don't like the drawing, if you don't like the placement, even if you've committed 10, 15 minutes to it, really in the grand scheme of things, that's not a lot of time. So it's better to just push back, go back more towards an earlier stage, readjust the pose or the cropping on your picture, and then jump right back into painting it. Now our lovely model here has very fair skin and light hair, so with the lighting that we have on her, you know, a nice strong light on one side and then a beautiful softer blue fill light on another, we're not seeing a ton of dark shadows on here. It's all, for the most part, this is a very high key painting, which becomes a little more difficult sometimes to create the drama of a painting when you don't have a lot of really deep, rich, dark values. So we have other tools that we're going to need to turn to, and in this case, we're mostly going to be looking at color. You know, color is going to provide all of the drama for this painting. We do have a clear value pattern, which is really great. That makes painting this much more simple. You know, I can see obvious lights on her face and obvious darks on her face, and so when I squint down, I can see this sort of abstract shape that's being created on her face, and that makes it easier to render out the likeness of the model, the actual structure of the head as it relates to light. But when it comes to popping off the canvas and jumping to the viewer and, you know, demanding the viewer look at the painting, we don't have a lot of deep dark values here to deal with, and that's okay because this painting was designed with that in mind. You know, I knew what Rachel looked like before I started this painting, and so I made sure I was picking colors and making choices that would ultimately give me some sort of attention-grabbing beauty here, instead of trying to base this around value. You know, if I went with a really dark dress just to get some contrast, then when I went to go paint her face in, for example, and her flesh tone, there wouldn't be any contrast in the flesh tone, and it might look a little awkward. It might look a little out of place with her values overall being so light and the dress values overall being so dark. So now, you know, we have a nice kind of unity in the fact that everything is kind of light here. I'm going to see beautiful purples and blues in the shadow and pinks. It's really quite lovely here. Now I am trying to be faithful to what I see color-wise, but simple to what I see shape-wise, if that makes sense. So I want this to kind of look like a fuzzy impression of her when I relax my eyes. And this is something that you can practice at home even if you're not planning a big painting. And it's something that I think everybody should practice at home because it increases our color observational skills. And it increases our ability to spontaneously respond to colors we see and thus capture them immediately and get a more lifelike impression. So in this case, we're trying to do a little bit more than just capture the color quality. We're also trying to capture a little bit more of the design. So there's a little more intent here. But it's always beneficial to focus on what you need to develop and enhance in your own work the most. You know, if you need to do a separate color sketch and then do a color sketch that combines your design with it as well. And that will give you a little bit more leeway to capture more accurate color. Really, it comes down to this idea that you should do as much studies as is required for you to feel confident that you're capturing the idea that you want, and that you'll have enough guidance later when doing a more finished dramatic piece that you're not going to get hung up on one element. You know, the color won't hold me back later because I'm doing so much of this studying now of color. And I'm going to remember little bits of this later on, you know, when I'm doing this big painting, kind of remember how I created some of these transparencies and how I mix some of these colors to get some loaded brushwork with little bits of red and green and purple all kind of spliced into each other. One of the other things you'll notice about a color sketch like this is that I'm not being too concerned with sparing my paint and preserving my paint. You know, I'm really scooping in and digging down to whatever I have and just laying that out. And I might even pull up more paint and throw it on. You know, it's quite a lot of paint for a quick, small painting. And that is one thing that has put a lot of people off, a lot of students of mine off from doing all these color sketches, because in doing this rapid, fast, impulsive mixing, you're going to go through a lot of paint. Sometimes even more so than a final painting. You know, if this was just a 16 by 20 painting that I would be doing, or something like that, around that size, for the final painting, I would probably use more color here, or more oil paint here on my color sketch than on the actual painting. But because of the nature of this, where I'm wanting just clean, bright, vibrant colors, I will use just quite a bit of paint here. Now I should point out some of the colors that I'm using on here, and I'll go over them again while I'm doing the larger, more detailed painting, but a few of these colors that are worth noting on this palette are this yellow, this red, and this blue, and then also, I guess, this green here. But the yellow, the red, and the green are all lakes made by Michael Harding. It's a yellow lake and a scarlet lake. The green is a green lake, and these lakes are synthetic pigments that are kind of dyes adhered to inert pigments that don't have color. Kind of like alizarin crimson. We're all sort of familiar with alizarin crimson. It has strong, striking, staining power. You know, it gets in everything. These colors are kind of like that too. They're super, super powerful. And students will find them difficult to control in the beginning. You know I did. They just sort of dominate mixtures. But what you learn is that they're great at coming up with, you know, a huge range of colors because they're so strong. And it's easy to shift a color mixture one way or another just with a little bit of those lakes. The other thing too is that you can actually get really, really light colors of very bright chroma, you know, very intense light colors, because white will lighten them, but they're so pigmented, they're so strong in their influence that as the value gets lighter and lighter, the color retains a lot more of its color, its chroma, its punch. And so highlights don't go dead nearly as quickly. You know, when I have students who are painting flesh tones, for example, and you know they just add white and their chroma goes dead and they just can't get any of that living human flesh tone in there. I recommend these lakes because just a little bit of lake and a lot of white will allow you to really get a really strong, vibrant color. I'm going to go thicker here for some of this gold. May end up modifying some of my values later to get that gold. Or I might just go really thick. I'll try both. I have two methods of getting a really light value. One is to load up the brush stroke, which is a common way of doing it. The other is to actually go a little more transparent. Wipe down until you get back to the base of the canvas and create almost like a stain or what seems like a glaze transparently on there, just utilizing a little bit of thin paint. So for this I'll try to go a little thick though. I like the idea of that there being a nice thick accent for that necklace. I'll just finish a little bit of color on the face and then throw some background in, and then we'll be done. Now, as I had mentioned before, the background, what I do here is going to become really important for the background. I will be pretty fatigued by the time I'm actually going to be painting the background in this painting. So I need to have a pretty clear idea of where I want to go, because I'll be so tired that I may have the ability to make good decisions to replicate what I observe, but my decisions about what I might like aesthetically will be a little less strong because I'll be so tired and I'll have stared at this painting for so long. So I want to have a pretty clear pathway, and it's going to be very abstract back there. It's not going to be it's not going to be exactly what I see. You know, I've just sort of taped or clipped some flowers to a fabric background, and you know, it looks nice and fine, but if I painted that literally, it would be really confusing. People would look at it and say, why did you just clip flowers to a background and sheet and then paint that? You know, I want to make it look like things are flowing, things are natural, believable, beautiful. You know, we're trying to create this fiction that someone could look at and think is possible, even if it's, you know, pure fantasy. And I think that's what makes the strongest and most interesting fantasies, is when we can believe that we can be a part of them. Switch to a bigger brush for the background if I've got one. This will work. Now I plan backgrounds pretty intentionally. You know, the way it's kind of set up here, the way everything's lit here, it's intended so that I have a value that's sort of between the lights and the darks, which is a method that a lot of schools will utilize when posing a model, really to make it kind of easier to see the figure and the flesh tones. Here I'm going to use it to really highlight the colors on the model. If I get a little too close in value to the lights, for example, you're going to lose some of that information of the lights of the figure and the lights of the dress into the background. It's not going to pop out as much. But just by shifting that value, or posing, in this case, my fabric background here so that it's a little bit in between the lights and a little bit in between the darks, then all of a sudden the figure can glow just a little bit more. We can get a little more of that emerging quality out of it. This is where I want to get really loose and really crazy. I'm going to put colors in here that might not exist up there, and that's okay, because the point of this is not necessarily to capture what's there. It's to make a painting that I deem to be aesthetically pleasing and beautiful, and that I think other people would want to look at too. And so I will take some information from what I see. For example, I like some of the purples down here. I like throwing that in there. And then I'll lose some other information I see. I might not make this top so white. I might key it a little more to the colors of the whole painting, the greens, the golds, the greens and yellows. Maybe a little more green back there, a little more blue. Whenever I'm laying down color and making a decision about it, it pretty much comes down to a simple set of decisions. Value first. Is my color supposed to be lighter? It's supposed to be darker. And then after that, is it more red or more yellow or more blue? And then after that, is it more colorful? Is it less colorful? A few simple questions that I ask myself every time I lay down a mark that allows me to really rapidly respond and filter out the complexity of color choice, by giving yourself fewer options and by removing the sort of ambiguity or subjectivity of color. It allows me to work a little faster. And then it frees me up to be a little more creative because of that. If I'm always struggling with the technical of how to get a color I want, then I can't shift the colors and make them what I want quite as easily. All right, I think what this needs now is just some hard edges and then some of those flowers, and I think we'll have a solid color sketch. We'll be able to move on to the big painting. One of the things that tends to make color sketches so nice and always kind of surprises students, and often students will say, oh, my initial color sketch or my initial block-in was so much nicer and now it's all noodled and doesn't look as good. A large portion of that is because your initial work that you lay down has, for the most part, significantly harder edges everywhere. And those harder edges translate into sort of a juiciness, richness of paint that doesn't stay there if you noodle things, if you sort of lick the canvas, if you over-soften. We tend to think we need to soften things to make dimensionality. So then when things get over-softened, then we lose this sort of juicy, delicious quality to the paint that makes it so painterly, so much like oil paint. And it just becomes this kind of frothy, scrubbed-on, sort of unflattering mess. And a lot of that is going to come down to the paint application, the hardness of the edges, the retention of the original strokes. And so that's what is going to make this color sketch here so strong, and that's what we're going to want to try and retain as we move to the large painting. So I'll use this as keys for my edges later on. I might see an edge up there later that I think is supposed to be softer, but I might look at my color sketch and say, man, that looked really good when it was just this nice, juicy, rich stroke on there. It really popped. And so I might make the decision, because of this impulsive sketch, to actually alter the edge quality that I see and make something a little more juicy, a little more rich. Kind of this idea that she's sort of almost sitting on this ring of flowers. That's kind of what I had put in my initial design, so I'm going to throw a little of that on there. Yeah. I have to get excited about the color sketch stage. You know, this is the excitement part of the painting that needs to give me enough juice to propel me for the rest of a big painting. And a big painting can be daunting. So if I'm not really excited, really in love with what I'm doing here, it's going to be quite a bit harder to finish things off. And I think now, after I've got this background in here, I'm really starting to get into this. And you know, this is when the heart starts to pound and you're like, oh yeah, this might actually be a really good painting. I think we should do this. I think people are going to like this. I think I'm going to want to hang this on my wall. And you know, if you're doing a big painting, you really have to want to hang it on your wall because they're big paintings. You know, it's not easy to just throw them in the closet or a corner somewhere. So you really have to want to do it. Okay, this is great. So pretty. Do the last few little marks up here. Give it a little highlight on the hair. Yeah. Okay. It's kind of just some design things right now. I'm just kind of flowing around, seeing if there's anything else I want to change design-wise, maybe some bigger marks in some areas, smaller marks. But I think for the most part, that's it. I like that. Okay. With our color sketch now, it's time to turn towards the large canvas. And this is where things can get a little complicated with a large format painting. There's lots of ways to record a figure on a canvas this size. You know, historically, we think about doing small drawings and maybe gridding them or using pinholes to do a projection, or even using a set of mirrors to project an image of the model onto the canvas. We're going to take a more naturalistic approach to this, in that we're going to actually be observing the model directly. We're not going to be constructing anything out of our heads and then pulling the model back to fine-tune the drawing. We're actually going to be trying to record what we see on the canvas. And we're going to be using some of the 19th century techniques of sight size. Also, we'll use comparative measurements. We'll use a lot of angles to figure out where placements of things should be. But the advantage here that we're going to have over some of the more historical methods is with a single figure where we're not interrelating a complex scene, we can just observe and directly copy over onto our canvas. And to do that, it's going to require that we have enough room to step back, first of all. We want to be able to see our canvas from a distance. And it's also going to require that we get our canvas reasonably close to the model. So right now we have the canvas a little in front of the model, which in the method of sight size is going to yield a figure that's just under life size. So we might have a 7 or a 7.5 inch head as opposed to an 8 inch head. But on a canvas this size, I think that'll work quite well, because if we did the full actual life size of Rachel on here, it would probably feel a little crammed. And I want her a little smaller on the canvas so that I can actually capture some of the flowing fabrics and drapery. So we're going to be working a little under life size, but I'm going to be drawing and painting everything the size that I see it. And that's where some confusion happens with this idea of sight size. Sight size is not actually drawing and painting things the size they are. It's the size that they're observed from a set distance. And so here I'm going to be stepping back, 10 to 15 feet to see, observe both Rachel and my canvas in one view, from my view. And I'll just be copying every line and every angle, every placement of her and the fabrics onto my canvas. And it's going to require that I step back to roughly the same spot every single time, that I make my observations from the same point in space, wherever my eyeballs are in space, forward or back, up or down. That's going to have an impact on the size that the drawing and painting becomes with the sight size method. because this is such a large painting, it's going to require also that we step back to avoid distortion. And this is not something that we tend to think about when we're first starting or we're in art school, especially because in most schools we don't have a substantial amount of room to back up. And we're typically not working on really, really large format paintings. But Leonardo actually discovered this a long time ago, and he writes about it in his notebooks. Something to the effect that to avoid a distortion, like a fisheye on the canvas, you need to be able to step back at least 3 times the distance of the longest dimension of the canvas. So in this case, our canvas is a little under 6 feet. I think we're at something like 68 inches. So that means I'm going to need to be stepping back roughly 15 feet or so to avoid any elongation or fisheyeing of the model or of the canvas. And that's what tends to happen. We tend to stretch things out because you're looking up and then you're looking down. And when you're looking down, the distance to the bottom of the canvas, for example, is further from your eyes than the distance that's eye level. And that creates that distortion and that elongation. So ideally, we want to step back as far as possible to mitigate the difference in distances between your eyes in the top of the canvas and your eyes in the bottom of the canvas and your eyes in the middle of the canvas. And that will help ensure that everything is the correct size. It sounds kind of complicated, but really the main thing to remember is get 3 times the distance of your canvas back, and you'll help to avoid that. It has in fact happened to me. I've done this before when I first started painting larger format pictures. I did a painting of my wife, and I didn't even notice it at the time because I was using just the formal sight size, where I take a measurement, slide it over. But I was so close that her torso was elongated by only a couple of inches. But interestingly enough, an old Russian painter who studied in Russia at one of the prominent schools over there, he saw it, and he said, "Tim, your painting is too long. The torso is too long. Remember, Serov says, always step back and compare both the height and the width and count the number of heads." And he told me all of these things to make sure that the elongation didn't happen. And he called me on it, and nobody else even noticed it, but it was just a few inches and it made the difference. And so as you go bigger and bigger with your canvas, you just have to remember to step back further and further. Aside from that, I'll just be taking what are called levels and plumbs. So I'll hold my pencil here so I see the top of Rachel's head and see where that falls on the canvas, and then I'll make a mark. I'll do the same with the torso and the bottom. So until I have a series of tick marks that gives me my general layout and placement. Then I'll get a few broad scheme lines going to describe the gesture of the pose and the major angles. And then after that, I'll just start jumping into the face. We'll see if we can draw some of the face in before we dip in with the paint. The idea, hopefully, is that I'll have a clear enough drawing on here that when I go into painting, I can be confident and just lay paint straight onto the canvas and then jump right into it. So let's get started here. I have her set up right now so that I should just be able to take a level directly over and see the mark where it's going to fall on the canvas. And I'm just checking to make sure that I like where all of the placements are of things. Similar to where my color sketch is. I don't want her to be too low on the canvas or too high on the canvas. And I think right now this is a pretty good distance here. So I'm using some nitrum charcoal here. It's like a willow charcoal. It's for the most part pretty soft, so it's easy to draw on a canvas with it. And it's also very correctable. One of the critical things to remember about sight size is that you need to lock in to your position every single time. I mentioned that your head has to be at the same point in space. Your eyes have to be the same distance and height as they were for each measurement. And so I'm going to go back to that first mark I made on the canvas up there towards the top. And every time I make a sight size measurement, I'm going to lock in to that mark before I advance and make any more measurements. The bottom of the head here, which is what I laid, was incorrect. But when I locked in and checked it, I could see where the correct height should be. And then I adjust it from there. And that's something that's important to remember. We all make mistakes. And almost always the first mark you make is not going to be the correct one. And that's why we check and check and refine until eventually it's in the spot that it needs to be. But leave your incorrect measurements until you're confident that you've made the right one. And you have then an aperture for figuring out how to make the correction. I normally tone my canvas, especially for these large ones. The toning actually helps kill the white of the canvas, but it also gives me a sort of a guideline of where to put all of these marks in here, so that I can see from a distance, and by the time I walk up to the blank canvas, I haven't made an error. The unfortunate thing in this case is that my canvas here is a little less white than I typically have the canvas. It's an oil-primed linen surface, which is a great surface to work on, but sometimes it goes a little yellower and needs to be bleached in the sun for it to really have its white luminosity. And this hasn't really been bleached, so it's a little bit darker, and it's actually about the value that I would have toned my canvas to before, had I toned it. So in this case, I don't really need to tone my canvas. It makes it a little harder to do some of the drawing, but I think overall it will help things be a little cleaner and not get too heavy or too dark. Okay, this is my knees, so I like where the knees are going, and I'm going to check my distance to the bottom of the canvas. And this is a good example of why you need to be able to step back, because from this distance for me, this looks like a huge amount, and this looks like almost no space. So I might be inclined to change my relationships if I was working this close to the canvas. And that's why I need to step back, so I can observe and check and see what my actual relationships are. And I can see that the mark that I made in the middle is actually not even below the halfway point. It's a little above the halfway point, which is good. So that I've actually raised it a little from what it is on my color sketch. So I'll lock into a level line with the top of the head for each measurement, and then I'll also do a check from the top of the head to the chin and make sure that my marks on there are still locking into her marks, not because I think the model might move and I might need to correct her, but because I need to make sure myself that I am in the right position. At this point, I'm moving back and forth quite a bit, and the odds of me moving are way greater than the odds of my model moving. And I only bring that up because it's really easy when we're doing something so rigid and kind of slow moving as this idea of sight size that we have too much confidence that our measurements are correct. And we say, well, I measured it, it must be the model that moved. But when we're talking about my head being 2 millimeters closer to the model or 2 millimeters away from the model affecting the quality of my measurement, it's a much greater chance that I'm the one who's moved and not the model. And so I'm always willing to explore the situation or the idea of self-correction before I shift over and start correcting the model. Rachel, can I get you to rotate your top half actually a little towards me? Yeah, like that. That's great, thanks. I want to see a little more shoulders there. Okay, I've got some of my vertical placements in here, from the head to the knees down here, down to the fabric where it hits the ground, and then this is going to be some fabric that trails off. And so now I'm going to start fine-tuning my left and right placement, and then I'll have pretty much all the ticks that I need to figure out where she's going to ultimately end up. I think I, for the most part, want her fairly centrally located. Sometimes I move things a little off-center, sometimes it's heavily weighted to one side. Really, it comes down to the situation, the pose that I want, but I think for this one, I pretty much want something that's relatively close to center, so that she's just kind of falling, cascading down. That box there of tick marks that I'm getting kind of represents the outermost boundaries of the figure. All right, so I'm just going to fine-tune my placement here. The widest part of her torso is the shoulders, so I'm just getting that width in here right now. My initial marks were a little too wide, so I think it's going to be something more like that. But the key to this method, this site size method and all of this measuring really is to continually check to see if we're correct. You know, we have to assume that all of the marks that we've made are estimation, open to human error. And that's fine. You know, that's part of the charm of what makes paintings nice sometimes, is because we have that human element that's not exactly a static photograph, but we do have to correct them within reason. So just every time a mark is made, we just double check it to verify its accuracy. And overall, we can mitigate some of the major errors, and things will be more and more correct. A lot of people find this approach to be a little stifling, actually. They like to be a little more intuitive and free. They feel that it's a little too slow moving for them. But really, if you shift your focus and stop thinking about how much you have to measure, and instead focus on developing the speed and efficiency with which you measure, then eventually you won't end up spending much time on this stage at all. And it becomes more liberating rather than more constricting, because we can start to throw in more marks and get to the meat and more interesting parts of the drawing right away. I have some of these tick marks and outer parameters now for my torso and for my head, and so we can start throwing in some more angled lines here to describe the gesture of the pose. And I'm not going to get too carried away with the drawing of the body. I really just want to make sure that I have kind of an idea of where it's going, because I'll draw the body and then paint and address the body later on, after I've keyed my head correctly. I want my head painted in all the way so that, you know, if it does, as it might, grow a little by half an inch or so, or shrink a little by half an inch or so, then I'll be able to address that and shift my drawing of the body so that everything is still correctly proportioned. If I commit too much time to measuring right now in the body, especially if, for example, if I were slower at measuring, as people are when they start this process, then you could spend so much time doing so much measuring in here and then ultimately have to throw it all away. It would essentially be a waste of time. I don't want to commit any more time here measuring the body, actually, than I'm willing to waste, so to speak. This series of diagonal lines here we actually call a scheme, or a schema, some artists say. And it's really sort of like a structural bones of a drawing. It's intended to just sort of encompass the figure, to give us sort of an idea of all the abstract shapes in the figure, simple shapes, simple big lines, sort of like a container that we're putting the figure in. And I think there's even more gesture to this pose. I can definitely get more angles and more interest in there, but I'm going to wait until I have the face in. I want to be able to really commit some energy to it. So now we'll move on to the face. I've got a pretty good idea of the placement of the body. I'm pretty happy with the relationship to the edges of the canvas. I feel like if I went too much smaller in here and in here, then I would end up with so much space that it would seem unintentional, and I'd have to just spend most of the time painting background. So I think this is a good amount of fill. There's a little bit at the top that I can play with. I think if the knees are right here, then I have enough of a cascade down the figure that I can really get to play with some of the folds and some of the fabrics and have some fun with that. And I think this head is a good size head. It's probably going to be about 6 inches, it looks like. But that'll be appropriate for this size painting, I think. When I instruct students on how to draw a head, it's very counterintuitive to what most of them have done before, because I'm a big fan of these proportional boxes, these sort of tick marks, like I've put the head in this box right now. I think a lot of artists actually do some variation of this, but they usually do it in form of tick marks, just a little tick for the where the eyes are going to be, a tick for where the top of the head's going to be, little ticks everywhere that are kind of markers for where features and lines and things should be placed. I usually instruct my students to go a little bit further. I encourage them to put it all the way into a box so that there's no ambiguity as to what shape they're trying to record. So for example, I just did a mark that represented the top of the eye socket on the left, and I'm relating the placement of this mark from the top of the head to the top of the eyebrow, and then from the bottom of the head to the top of the eyebrow. And I sight-sized both measurements from the model. I measured how big this distance was on the model, and then made sure it was the same on my painting, and then the same for this distance down here. So I'm pretty confident that that's correct in relation to this overall head. So eventually what's going to happen is I'm going to get a box for the eye, a box for the other eye, maybe a box for the shadow shape on the nose, box for the mouth. She'll end up looking like a big robot by the end of it, a robot face. But that robot face will contain a lot of information. It'll tell me basically the proportional structure of all of the features of her face. And so with a few quick lines, I'll be able to chop it down and all of a sudden have a likeness that is correctly proportioned. Whereas if I were to jump right away to features and right away to spheres and circles and trying to get a more gestural approach, then I could really lose out on some of the really subtle relationships of proportion and width and how that affects all of the structure of her head. So every time I go back here, I lock in to make sure that my the top of the head and the bottom of the head are the same on my painting and on the model. And interestingly enough, since I'm going back to relatively the same spot each time, the distance that the chin to the top of the head has reflects how much tilt her head has. If she starts to look more forward, then this distance would elongate, and I'd be able to tell that immediately right away. But if it's the same each time, it means and I'm in the same spot, it means I can be relatively confident that Rachel's head is in the same position. So that's going to be a nice giveaway, and if I lock into this every single time, which takes only a couple of seconds, then before I place any of these features on here, I can make sure that her head is in the correct position, which is really important. And one of the things I think students struggle with a lot is when doing a portrait, and it's taking them a longer period of time, they may not notice if the model slips out of pose. So all of a sudden they have one eye that's correct and one eye that's kind of floating in a strange spot, and then a mouth that's kind of skewed and shifted over. And if you don't catch those things, they can snowball pretty quickly. So that locking in is just a really great way of quickly and efficiently making sure the pose is correct, I am correct, the drawing is correct. It's a lot of correction, verification that's happening there. So that represents the right side of the eye there. And we'll do the left side. Again, every time I make a mark, I'm assuming it's wrong. So I go back and I lock in, and then I check the mark I just made, and then adjust it as needed. Now, the amount of adjusting that I'm having to do here is probably a lot less than you'll have to do at home, unless you have a lot of experience drawing already. It happens with experience, really. Good experience, practicing this over and over and over again. You get better and better and better at making these marks accurately. But in the beginning, the majority of your time is spent correcting marks. And for my students especially, I'm a stickler for making them correct and correct and correct, and making them slow down when they're going so fast that they finish their drawing and there's a lot of errors. They have to go slower and slower and slower, and it seems really painful, really, to go that slow in the beginning. But eventually, they start to appreciate that because of that dedication to making sure that they corrected things and got it right over and over and over again, that the speed at which they're able to arrive at that correct solution increases over time. So what I'm doing here now, I am doing a lot of measuring. Eventually, our goal is to construct what we refer to as a shadow map. So a lot of people refer to what I'm doing now as mapping. I'm sort of charting, like a cartographer would, where all of the shadows are on her face, or more precisely, where all of the dark shapes are. Not everything I'm mapping is a shadow. So for example, her eyebrows, they're not a shadow, but they are a dark shape. And when I squint down, they look like a dark shape, and I can't distinguish them from the shadows. So I'm mapping those out right now. And when this is all done, I'll have what we refer to as the shadow map, which is just a collection of abstract shapes that reveal the light and dark pattern on the model. And that in turn reveals the structure of the model, because how light interacts with form is what's giving us this map. And that's essentially how we as humans are able to discern what it is we're looking at. It's by this pattern of value first. First we look to value, then we look to color. So because I have a clear, strong value pattern on the model, due to our nice, strong light on her, then I'm going to map out all of these shadows, and hopefully by the end of it, it should look pretty close to her likeness. Although I will point out that despite that I will use every reasonable effort to make this painting look like Rachel, the primary goal of this painting is not to do a portrait painting of Rachel. It's to do a figure painting. A figure painting that, while may resemble Rachel, is primarily about the idea, the content, the pose, the emotion it evokes, and less about somebody being able to identify exactly who it is. And in fact, in large paintings like this, where it's more about the concept and the idea, it's typically less advantageous if it looks more specifically like the person. And we can see this even in historical paintings. There's a deliberate and conscious effort to mitigate the uniqueness of the faces in these bigger scale paintings, so that we don't focus on who the individual is, but instead focus on the idea or the narrative that's being told. And it wasn't really until the naturalists came along in the mid-1800s, and then later the influences of illustration by artists like Norman Rockwell, did we start to really include the unique individual as a part of the narrative, as opposed to having the model be kind of an actor for the part. We now think about who is the person in this painting. So it's kind of a different idea here. You know, this isn't as much of a naturalistic painting. This is a constructed fantasy that we're trying to build here that might exist, but it doesn't matter if it does exist. It's just nice to get lost in this field of beautiful color and flowers and fabric. And so if it doesn't look 100% like Rachel, which is unlikely, but if it doesn't look exactly like her, that's not really a big deal. We're more worried about the design, the painting, the aesthetic itself. So I'm just working my way down. It gets kind of tedious, I will admit that. But this is the work, I think, of the painting here. This is the eating your vegetables so you can have the dessert. Because, to be quite honest, it's much easier to draw something when I know where that something is supposed to go. The head lift and the head tilt is the most dangerous thing to gamble on. But you got a good model. Pays off in the end. You're doing great. All right, so we've mapped out some boxes for the nose, box for the mouth. And we're going to get the shadow on the right side of the face, and the left and right parameters of the mouth. And then our shadow map will be kind of ticked into place. And from there, we can just start cutting some angles. Now we do have a little more we have the head tilted back a little, and we have the head angled over a little, really nice elements that produce a much more interesting painting than just a model staring straight ahead. And I have to keep that in mind because it's our natural tendency and inclination to try and straighten everything out when we draw it and paint it. We get things more vertically aligned. We have the head looking much more straight on instead of, in this case, tilted up. And that straightening out happens because we end up shifting the placement of features back to sort of our perceived notion of where things should fall on the face. And the only way to really avoid that is to take special care, as we are in this case, to really map out where the placement of each of these things is supposed to be. So as long as I draw, for example, a mouth shape within the box of where I've placed it, for the most part, it will reveal that the head is tilted up because of the human's ability to recognize the placement of a mouth on a head and fill in the gaps with our understanding, our intuitive understanding of perspective, and identify and understand that she's a person who's looking up and not just a person who has a mouth in a really weird spot. So I'm taking a lot of what are called plumb lines. I'm seeing the relationship of elements on the face, and in this case the neck, and how it relates to where I've placed the eye. So I can see that the neck is going to intersect the jaw about this distance from the inside corner of the eye. And that might shift a little bit, but for the most part that's about correct. And that will in turn help me figure out where the boundaries of the jaw will ultimately be. All right, we've got now the right side of the nose. And now we've created our robot head box. All of our features are mapped out where they should be. We have the outside of the head. In this case, I'm including the hair, so the face is actually going to cut in a little more. So we have all of the proportions of the overall head with the hair, where all of the features need to be in the whole field of the head, as well as the size of each of those features in relation to each other. We've now solved the majority of the drawing problems that most people have in creating a likeness, as well as the gesture and the tilt. And now we can move forward to actually carving these out and making them look more like the individual features that they're supposed to be. I'm going to start with kind of a broad scheme of the face, actually, just so I can get a little container for these features. Now, one thing to remember about schemes, which are, again, these sort of angled lines that show us sort of the gesture of the subject here, is that they should be flexible and open to change. They're not what we would call anchors, something that's rigid that we're going to measure off of. We might measure off of the placement of our features because we've done such a delicate job of figuring out where they go. So we might change things based off of these measurements, but we won't change things based off of scheme lines. So for example, when we move inside the eye shape and we start sort of sculpting the eye shape, taking away some of that mass, we'll never go outside of the dimensions of the proportions that we've established outside of that box. We'll always stay within the box, as though we're carving a chunk of marble here. And we'll chisel it down. And as long as our eye remains, here at the bottom, there at the top, there at the left, there at the right, as long as those boundaries stay the same, our scheme lines and our more subtle detail lines can change as much as we want or be corrected as much as we want. And we can just keep sort of muddling through until we've figured out what the orientation of those angles and lines should be. But the second we start second guessing our proportions, our shapes, our placements, and we start making things bigger or significantly smaller, then all of a sudden the set of relationships that we have established on the drawing starts to crumble and things no longer look the way they're supposed to. So these proportions, these placements are what we're going to refer to as our anchors for making all decisions. But these angles, these scheme lines, these smaller shapes that we start to draw, those are all going to be in a state of flux until we've decided we really like them in relationship to the boxes and proportions that we've set. What we should hopefully start to see is that pretty quickly now we're going to have a likeness begin to come through. I'm still going to lock in to my head top and head bottom when I do all these measurements and figure out where things should be. For example, where this piece of hair should be kind of cut. I locked into the top and the bottom, and then I took a sight size measurement from the eye outward, this distance, and that kind of tells me where that line should pass through. Again, that might be a little bit flexible, that might change a little bit, but I can be pretty confident that it's correct because I based it off of one of my anchor shapes.
Just imagine what it would feel like to be able to express yourself fully through a painting, to really cut loose and let your paint and your passion fly. There's no better way to accomplish this than to create a figure painting on a life-size canvas. Streamline Art Video is proud to team with artist Tim Rees to bring you modern figures, painting big, fresh, and loose. In this instructional video, Tim spends nearly 7 hours with you, taking you from the early stages of a large, colorful figure painting all the way to the final brushstrokes. As a highly successful instructor and the head of the Art Renewal Center approved Rees Atelier in Arizona, Tim leaves nothing out as he shows you how to navigate the mechanics of figure painting on a large scale. His enthusiasm for supersized paintings is evident, and you'll catch on to that enthusiasm as you plan what you'll do with a jumbo canvas, some big brushes, and a good amount of paint. There are very few things as striking as walking into an art show, museum, or even into someone's home and seeing a massive figure painting. A painting like that is the center of attention, a surefire conversation starter. And in this video, Tim is going to show you, step by step, how to create paintings that will garner that kind of attention. From an expressive color study to measuring tips, drawing, and creating a shadow map, you'll establish a strong foundation for the painting that is to come. Imagine how fun it will be to accurately include the smaller details while still harnessing the overall desired feeling of the painting. You'll get to express yourself and your unique style through scale, color, and texture to produce paintings you'll be proud of to show or sell.
In this large format figure painting video, I hope students are able to get an insight into the mechanics behind painting large, avoiding common distortions that we can identify even in old master paintings that could be eliminated with a better understanding of how to work large.
Available in both DVD and as a digital download. Tim Rees, Modern Figures, Painting Big, Fresh, and Loose. We'll show you just how fun and impactful painting fresh, loose, and free can be.
Well, that was Tim Rees from the video Modern Figures, and you can learn more about it at lilyartvideo.com. And there's a special discount for you today only in the comments section. Make sure you look for that. Now let's get right to our interview with Tim Rees.
I first started oil painting in a more realistic manner about 9 years ago. It was 2009, the beginning of 2009. Before then, I did some abstract paintings and some acrylic paintings. I drew on and off, just kind of dabbled every couple of months perhaps, but nothing serious. But it was early 2009. That's when I first started to lay into oil painting and actually try to make some progress in learning how to actually paint. My inspiration to paint has shifted dramatically over the years. And for me, that's actually been one of the bigger struggles, I think, as an artist, is the motivation to continue doing it and always sort of this question of why. When I first started painting, it was easy. It was because I wanted to hang paintings on my wall that I had no means of being able to buy because they were just too expensive. And so I figured rather than working my whole life to try to afford some of these paintings I wanted, I could just learn to paint, and then I would have as many paintings as I wanted to hang on the wall. So that was a good motivation for me for quite a number of years, probably 5 or 6 years. And the challenge of it kind of kept me going. And eventually, as I began to understand more and more, and you kind of unveil the mystic nature of trying to do a painting, and you see sort of the behind-the-scenes world of how it all works, it became a little less magical. I started to fill my house with paintings. I was still selling lots and lots of paintings, but I still had a lot of paintings. And I had pretty much all the paintings I wanted. So I did go through one of those sort of existential crisis of why am I doing this, and should I continue to do this? And there's so many other painters I know in the world, and so should I keep painting? Because for me, I need something more than just the me reason. It worked for me for a while, but I needed to do something greater. And since then, I found other reasons to paint. Teaching has been one of them. I found that while there's a lot of really great artists in the world, and there are a lot of great teachers in the world, sometimes it's difficult to find somebody who is skilled, really skilled, who can articulate a lot of concepts really well. And so I felt that I had that to contribute. But beyond that, I have a grander notion of a few painting series that I want to do, one of which involves science, hoping to potentially paint these grand schemes and ideas of science, as well as humans that have pioneered these ideas and how it connects to humanity, much in the way that Carl Sagan came up with the original cosmos, which connected so much of the world to this idea of science. And I believe that science will ultimately be one of the contributing factors to our success as a species. And so I feel it's important to help to contribute to that in some way. So currently, that's one of my strongest motivations in continuing to paint. And I'm sure by the time I finish that project, I'll have found some other motivation to keep on going. I'm most known for my large-scale figurative works. Pretty women, for the most part, in flowing fabrics and flowers. Heavily inspired by Mucha and some of the Victorian artists of the 1800s. They're just very pretty paintings to look at, and when you start to see them on a large scale, it elicits, a sense of wonder that's not as easily accomplished on a smaller painting. And I think that's originally what gave me a decent amount of notoriety, was when I started to do these large paintings with splashy, flowy fabrics and wild flowers floating everywhere. And then aside from that, really portrait sketches, really, nice, strong, direct impressions of people. I love being able to show up somewhere and just set up my paints and do a painting of somebody kind of on the spot without having to do all the meticulous studio setup that us artists sometimes have to do. It's kind of liberating and fun, almost like a party trick, and it always results in a good time at the end of it. Yeah, even though I'm primarily known for large format figure painting and portrait sketches, I really like to paint everything, and perhaps it's become a little bit of a flaw of mine that I don't want to specialize too much in one area, because I do love to paint plein air landscapes. I love to paint still life. I love to paint genre scenes of people, particularly my wife and my son. And I'm also doing, a series of science paintings, which I'm combining elements of the cosmos and landscape with figures and in more traditional methods of painting, like glazing and underpaintings. So I like to do everything, loose and abstract and fast and quick and slow and meticulous and in the methods of the old masters. So I kind of bounce around sort of wherever my interests take me, but whichever method I'm doing, I'm always striving to try and understand the method so I can more fully exploit it when I'm trying to say what I want to say in paint. I paint in oil because it offers a flexibility that other mediums just can't seem to do. And it's interesting because I used to not to like to paint. For years, I didn't like to paint. Probably for the first 4 or 5 years, I didn't like to paint. I only liked to draw. And that's probably one of the reasons why I became such a good painter, was because I was always drawing. When I wasn't painting, I was drawing. And I was probably drawing about 50% of the time and painting the other 50% of the time. So when I did paint, it was never out of joy. It was because I knew that to be remembered in history, you would probably need to be a painter, because there's a small fraction of artists throughout time that we remember who are only known for their drawings. If you want to go down in the history books, it had to be painting. So I kind of reluctantly decided to paint. I had paintings that I wanted to hang on my wall and do, and so that was a motivation to learn to do it. But it wasn't really because I wanted to paint. I wanted to draw all the time. And as I started to labor through painting more and more and start to understand painting more and more, it did become a little bit more enjoyable. It wasn't as much work, and I could have fun while doing it. And then I started to become fascinated with the technical aspects of paint, the way in which paint could be applied, the different effects that can be created with paint. You start to appreciate it on a whole nother level than just merely creating an image. And it's more versatile in being able to have a message and say something. So as I start to move into the stage of my career where I'm not just necessarily making pretty images, but I'm trying to convey things to people, oil paint becomes an ideal medium because there's so many different ways it can be used to create those messages. I paint loose portraits because of the direct connection to nature, I think, and the sense of immediacy and beauty that you get out of it. There's something liberating and fun and spontaneous where you get to combine elements of realism and abstraction in ways that tend to get lost over longer portraits. And when I first started painting, I did this almost every day. I went downtown to the Palette and Chisel, which is a club in Chicago where you can paint models every single day. And I would do a portrait a day, a portrait a day, a portrait a day. And I really was enchanted with this idea that you can learn to paint by just trying to do a quick impression of somebody, and then it would either come out good or not come out good, but it didn't matter because the next day you got to try again and try again and try again. So it's always like a fresh slate each time you paint a portrait. And because of that, it can be very encouraging because you can learn from your mistakes a lot more. And this direct portrait, like I said, it's a direct impression from life. It's not something that you're doing because you've studied and labored over understanding something and you're trying to articulate all these little subtle facets. It's something that you do to create that immediate, spontaneous kind of snapshot, I think is a good word to describe it. It's a snapshot. And it allows us to break outside of our comfort zone, and sort of fly by the seat of our pants and do things that you would never do if you were in the studio given infinite amount of time, because we're under this time constraint where you have to get things done. And there's not going to be time after this. The model's going to go home and you may never see the model again. And that's kind of a thrill and an excitement that you can't get when you're working in your studio with an infinite amount of time. It's almost like a sport. This is your one shot to do it. This is where you can get the heart pounding and go, because this is the only shot you might get. I originally started painting life-size figures because I wanted to get ready for this project of science paintings that I'm wanting to do, that I've begun to work on. And before then, I had never really painted anything large scale. I'd done one painting of a female back that was large format when I first came back from France. I'd been painting for a couple years. I went over to France to teach a workshop. I saw the museums there, which were unlike any museums I'd ever seen before, and I was just so inspired that as soon as I came back, I did a 6-foot painting. And then I didn't do any large format paintings again for probably 4 or 5 years. But when I started to get ready for this project that I wanted to do, these massive paintings where figures are life-size or larger than life-size, I knew that to fully develop the concept and to make it worthy of the places I want to show these paintings and sort of worthy of the idea that it is, I needed to hone my skills. I needed to understand the mechanics more fully, understand how to translate a small idea to a big idea, how to paint large format heads, and make sure that the gesture is not lost and that the idea is not lost. So it gave me a chance to experiment with all the stages of painting, coming up with concepts all the way to execution, while really observing something pleasant and beautiful that I would want to hang on my wall. So I was enchanted by all these older paintings, and I used them as sort of a inspiration to practice this idea of painting large. If I had to give students one piece of advice in their effort to learn how to paint, I think it would be to study masters. Whether or not it's living masters or historical masters, but there is so much information locked in every single painting that we look at that it opens up a whole can of worms in every single direction. You know, I could say that you should learn how to draw, or, you know, remember that all color is made out of red, yellow, and blue. You know, those are concepts that we kind of all know. You know, we all know we need to learn how to draw. We all know we need to learn to do this and this and this, and we need to practice every day. But really, I think the secret comes from careful study of successful works that have come before us. And if we honestly look and think and analyze and do our best to understand, then it opens a whole new realm of possibilities in what we're able to accomplish. And for a lot of artists that I've met over the years, it's interesting because they think of studying masters as a really special treat, almost like it's a self-indulgence to be able to just get lost in an old painting and sort of understand it and learn it and digest it and dissect it. And students that I've met over the years who are more casual students, who are more interested in having fun and maybe coming up with a good painting, for them it's different. You know, they look at studying an old painting as sort of work, as eating vegetables as opposed to eating the dessert. And so I think if you can find some works that inspire you on such a level that you would love to just look at them all day long, then that's going to add a special element to your work and help you skyrocket forward in your skill level beyond anything that you could hope to do just by sort of practicing in a bubble.
Well, that was Tim Rees, and the video is called Modern Figures. So you can learn more about that at lilyartvideo.com and look for the comments section and find the special discount code. Thank you for watching today. Make sure you share this with a friend.
Just imagine what it would feel like to be able to express yourself fully through a painting, to really cut loose and let your paint and your passion fly. There's no better way to accomplish this than to create a figure painting on a life-size canvas. Streamline Art Video is proud to team with artist Tim Rees to bring you Modern Figures, painting big, fresh, and loose. In this instructional video, Tim spends nearly 7 hours with you, taking you from the early stages of a large, colorful figure painting all the way to the final brushstrokes. As a highly successful instructor and the head of the Art Renewal Center approved Rees Atelier in Arizona, Tim leaves nothing out as he shows you how to navigate the mechanics of figure painting on a large scale. His enthusiasm for supersized paintings is evident, and you'll catch on to that enthusiasm as you plan what you'll do with a jumbo canvas, some big brushes, and a good amount of paint. There are very few things as striking as walking into an art show, museum, or even into someone's home and seeing a massive figure painting. A painting like that is the center of attention, a surefire conversation starter. And in this video, Tim is going to show you, step by step, how to create paintings that will garner that kind of attention. From an expressive color study to measuring tips, drawing, and creating a shadow map, you'll establish a strong foundation for the painting that is to come. Imagine how fun it will be to accurately include the smaller details while still harnessing the overall desired feeling of the painting. You'll get to express yourself and your unique style through scale, color, and texture to produce paintings you'll be proud of to show or sell.
In this large format figure painting video, I hope students are able to get an insight into the mechanics behind painting large, avoiding common distortions that we can identify even in old master paintings that could be eliminated with a better understanding of how to work large.
Available in both DVD and as a digital download. Tim Rees, Modern Figures, painting big, fresh, and loose. We'll show you just how fun and impactful painting fresh, loose, and free can be.